The Sultans of Delhi were prolific builders. The initial requirements of the new rulers were houses to live in and structures to pray. Islam in India introduced the masjids or the mosques, the maqbaras or the mausoleums, the madrasas or the centers of learning, and the caravanserais or the covered inns.
Secular architecture underwent a radical transformation, so much so that the entire skyline of North India changed. Secular architecture in all its various forms, whether we are talking about palaces, citadels, fortresses, gardens, everything took on a new look according to the prescriptions of the new rulers of Hindustan.
The entire skyline of Delhi changed during this time. Temples became fewer, and the skylines were dominated by mosques, which were elegantly designed but covered with restrained ornamentation. They used floral and geometrical designs. These combined with panels of inscribed verses from the Quran. They also borrowed from the Hindu motifs, such as lotus, swastika, and so on. Color was added to the buildings with the use of red and yellow sandstone and black and white marble.
We'll have to remember that ornamentation is banned in Islam, and representation of life forms, whether human or fauna, is interdicted. So naturally, to bypass this, the Muslim architects, which of course were mainly Indian craftsmen, they took recourse to arabesques, geometrical patterns in the form of ornamentation.
Around this time, temples in South India were being built following the old trivet methods of posts and lintels. Temple faces were decorated. Gopurams were common features. Human figures appeared on the surrounding walls.
In South India, temples continued to be built, decorated with figure sculptures. And of course, the system of construction of temples was absolutely different from the Islamic style. They followed the horizontal method of placing successive layers of stone in the ascending or descending order. They also followed the tribute method of posts and flat lintels. But there was one essential difference between the Hindu style of architecture and sculpture and the Islamic style. Hindu style was exuberant, exaggerated, rich in details, whereas Islam relied on simplicity and elasticity and lucidity of expression and an extreme economy of materials used and an organization of its arranged parts. The most interesting details which Islam brought, I wouldn't say brought to India, but established firmly on the Indian soil, were the two major elements of the dome and the arch. The Hindus had their own arches, but then those arches were based on the trabeate system of lintel and posts. The Islamic arch was built on a new method of arranging stones or brick in the shape of wedges or voussoirs, which spanned the empty spaces between the columns or the walls. What is the result? The result is a beautifully crafted, true pointed arch, which of course gives to you the elegant and spacious vault.
The skyline of Delhi was now dominated by elegantly constructed domes. With more experience and confidence, the domes grew in size. The arches and the domes created the need for a large number of pillars. This enabled spacious constructions and could be used for larger assemblies. Such structures required strong cement. For this, the Turks used fine quality lime mortar. Ornamentation of these structures was bare and frugal.
The sultans combined the universal heritage of local dome and arch with styles that were existent in Arabia, Iran, Spain, Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. But what made the mosques of South Asia distinctive was the true local touch. As importing craftsmen from abroad was difficult, time-consuming, and would have meant investment of large sums of money, the sultans of Delhi had to fall back on the Indian craftsmen, who empathized with this new building vocabulary, and in some places, why in some? In most places, they gave Hindu moldings to mosque architecture. The early mosques in India looked to the great mosque of Damascus, or say the Seljuk madrasas in Iran for inspiration. If we consider the Quwwatul Islam Mosque or the Might of Islam Mosque, which Qutbuddin Aibak commissioned in 1206 AD, we would be able to dwell on its essential indigenous character. Set on a huge courtyard, it consists of the dismembered parts of 27 standing Hindu and Jain temples, which of course accounts for that quite unkemtish looking courtyard on the western side where the mimbar stands. We cannot forget that the mosque remained central to the religion of Islam, with its origins being so simple. You just had to turn your head to the west, which is in the direction of the Mecca. In the Indian subcontinent, of course, it is the west, that is the Qibla, and you pray to your Lord. There were three motives behind which Qutbuddin Aibak had to construct the Quwwatul Islam or Might of Islam mosque. One, the swelling masses of new converts would have to be accommodated in a huge congregational yard. Two, the population whom he had conquered and vanquished, they would have to be impressed with the might of the new ruling dynasty. And three, he was competing with other rival Islamic states and nations. But what is the most distinctive, the most beautiful, and the most awe-inspiring structure within that courtyard standing at Mehrauli in South Delhi, of course, is the Qutb Minar.
This structure was called the Mazana. It was the tower from which the azan or the call for prayer was made. Later, this minar was named Qutb Minar. It was started by Qutbuddin Aibak. The minar was completed by Iltutmish. The tower is about 71.4 meters high. It has a tapering character. The four-storied structure was hit and partially damaged by lightning. Firoz Shah Tughlaq repaired it and added the fifth story. The ribbed and angular projections on the minar and the use of red and white sandstone makes it gorgeous. The balconies add to its beauty.
In the Islamic world, minars have an ostensible function to play. It is from here that the muezzins call the faithful to pray. But whether it was Seville or Samarkand, everywhere in this period, as in India, the minar became a symbol of the might of Islam. While constructing it, Qutbuddin Aibak had in his mind those wonderful minars which he had passed on his way in Afghanistan, and he tried to give a shape and form to it on the Indian soil. It is so very non-Indian in its character, in its form, in its design, in its conception, that for a moment you are nonplussed. Is it on Indian soil that we are standing? And then, once you've asked yourself that question, you say yes, because you notice the completely indigenous, the Indian red sandstone surface. What a beautiful piece of architecture that was. And how easily, within 50 years of the establishment of Islam, so many architectures could be achieved by the ruling dynasty. One major group had to play an important role in it. Those, of course, were the Indian craftsmen who had catered to the needs of Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain builders. But right now they are confronted with a new vocabulary. But with their skill, with their professional quality, they quickly adopted and adapted the new technique. So much so that in future, other dynasties would be taking them in to build their wonderful palaces and cities in Central Asia. Let's think of Samarkand. The plastic skill, their commitment to a new building form, it coalesced with the initiative, the skill, the enterprise, the leadership of the Turco-Afghan rulers of Delhi to give us such wonderful urban centers, mausoleums, and mosques.
The Delhi Sultanate was consolidated under Iltutmish. Under these Turkish rulers, the buildings grew in numbers. A wide range of buildings was constructed during this time. Indian craftsmen such as stonecutters, masons and so on were mostly engaged for this purpose.
The Indian craftsmen left their deep imprint in all these structures, whether in India or outside India. That is, continuation with the old trabeate system of post and flat lintel, their preference for dressed stone rather than brick, and employing richness of ornamentation, albeit figureless and abstract. In the Qutb zone, of course, extension of the courtyard continued over the centuries, and Alauddin Khalji, who envisaged himself as the second Alexander, had planned a tower, a minar which would dwarf the original minar. But what is left of this grandiose project, of course, is the only gem of a piece, that is the Alai Darwaza. A beautiful, sophisticated, short-pitched dome resting on a square plinth. The building itself is made of red sandstone and trimmed with marble and other decorations. It is meant to be a victory gate. It is 18 meters high, and how beautiful it looks against the backdrop of the massive minar.
Three most important sultans of the Tughlaq dynasty were Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and Firoz Shah Tughlaq. During their reign, urban planning flourished. Rich and varied architecture was seen in the innumerable structures. This was a period of creativity and energetic experimentations. Materials used for the buildings were standardized. The royal bureaucracy systematically engaged architects and engineers.
Urban planning between 1322 and 1388. This is the time of the Tughlaqs. And art styles now become, architectural styles both become so standardized because the Tughlaqs came up with a department which led to its indigenization of Islamic architectural modes and forms, and also to a conceptualization that would lead them on to build such wonderful buildings and impregnable fortresses. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, otherwise labeled as megalomaniac, eccentric, brash, remained in continuous dialogue with Hindus, not even refraining from attending their festivities. It is he who extended the citadel of Tughlaqabad. Even Ibn Battuta testifies to the major building initiative he undertook in this area. The practice of enclosing citadels within massive walls built of rubble with stucco painted faces is testified by that imposing, awe-inspiring architecture and fortress of Tughlaqabad. He built within the Jahanpana. He set up underground markets, and they still stand. Insofar as his successor is concerned, Firuz Shah Tughlaq, he had a more ambivalent attitude towards the Hindus. Few historians say that he could have had a Hindu mother. But nonetheless, he undertook the royal responsibility of maintaining public buildings, preserving, restoring architecture, and also initiating new things in the way of setting up cities like that of Firuzabad, cutting out canals, and building that wonderful Firuz Shah Kotla. Once again, it is a walled citadel within the city of Delhi. And what doesn't it contain? In fact, the very reason why Delhi emerged as one of the major Sufi centers of devotion is attributed to Firuz Shah Tughlaq. He built one of the world's greatest madrasas within the confines of the Kotla. He cut a deep 3-4 tiered well. And of course, he came up with that wondrous pyramidical 3-tiered structure. And atop it, he placed an Ashokan pillar, which he had carted from somewhere in Punjab, lying in absolute remote silence, and located it atop that wedding cake-like structure. It was no mean achievement.
During the reign of the Delhi Sultanate, the Persian influence was noticed in the types of buildings constructed. The surviving buildings of that period are mostly the mausoleums. The mausoleums erected around that period were usually characterized by a dome, arched windows covered with jali or stone lattice work. The interior walls were often adorned with decorative arches and niches along the walls.
We come to mausoleum architecture. The most original contribution in India to Islamic architecture was the royal mausoleum, a visible emblem of royal authority. Yet, while incorporating the mihrab or the prayer niche in its design, the emphasis lay on the piety of the ruler even in his death. But of course, any mausoleum would evoke the Quranic earthly paradisical imagery. It would be set in a charbagh, or a garden which in a sense would resemble that wonderful paradisical garden in Behesht. It had to be located within a charbagh, as I was saying, that is a garden which is divided into 4 quadrants by 4 running channels of celestial waterways. This idea of a sepulchre set in a garden or amidst fountains or waterways had originated in Islamic Egypt, and it culminated in that wondrous, many-splendored Taj Mahal under the Mughals. The very first of its kind in India was, of course, Sultan Iltutmish's mausoleum in the Mehrauli area within the Qutb courtyard. It is such a wonderful piece of art, so very Islamic, yet so very indigenized. On its exterior, it is bare and austere, but as one enters the courtyard of this mausoleum, he finds the execution of 30 chapters from the Quran in arabesques and in neat calligraphy. What is the content of these calligraphic verses? As usual, whatever Quwatul Islam carries or whatever the Qutb Minar carries. 1, the oneness of God. 2, the necessary obligations to this God, to this one God on part of the devotees. 3, the power of this Almighty God. But 4th, which is unique and which is not mentioned in the Qutb Minar or in the Quwatul Islam calligraphic scenario, is the fact that for the true believer on the day of the judgment waits eternal paradise. Even more spellbinding, of course, is the mausoleum. It's a landmark event, the mausoleum of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, standing near the Badarpur area outside of proper Delhi. It is entered through a pentagonal courtyard, has 4 lofty gateways on 4 sides. It is made entirely of rubble and masonry, but it is faced with marble, that is trimmed with marble and red sandstone. And it has the first marble dome of its kind. It is entered through a causeway which at one time spanned the Yamuna, and this causeway rests on arched piers. The Sultanate mausoleums, which originated in the Turco-Iranian domed square structures, developed into octagonal structures set amidst gardens, raised plinths, and with chhatris supporting the dome. But that would come later, under the Lodhis. Meanwhile, the mausoleum of Firuz Shah Tughlaq, which betrays his distrust of ostentation, is a bare, remote, yet graceful square pile of rubble and masonry topped with a shallow dome. But these mausoleums, their techniques, their designs, their building styles would be emulated also by provincial governors, court officials, and other sundry people.
After Firoz Shah Tughlaq's reign, and soon after Timur the Lame's sack of Delhi in 1398, building activities suffered a setback. But during this time, mausoleum architecture transformed into open pavilions. Slender, square or octagonal structures, they rested on raised plinths and had supporting domes with kiosks or chhatris.
Think of the wonderful maqbaras in the backyard of Indian International Center in Delhi. The Lodhi Garden is practically full of these mausoleums. Slender, beautiful pieces of art. However, the mausoleum that took the octagonal tomb to its pinnacle was, of course, the self-designed sepulchre of Sher Shah, now standing amidst a lake in Sasaram in Bihar. It is stately, somber, and yet so very graceful. A soldier of fortune who had ousted Humayun from Delhi and had ruled from 1540 to 1545, whose architecture, even in Delhi, think of the Purana Kila and the Kala-i-Khuna Mosque, had anticipated the grand proportions of the emerging Mughal architecture towards the 16th, 17th centuries. That same man became the stalwart who introduced a new style of Islamic architecture, tomb architecture, that would be followed up by the Mughals in the shape of Humayun's tomb, commissioned by Akbar the Great, in memory of his father.
Indigenous styles of architecture had developed at various provincial kingdoms under the Delhi Sultanate. They were often powerfully influenced by the local traditions of architecture. Muslim and Hindu forms and traditions of architecture mixed and mingled with each other.
During the 15th and the 16th centuries, as Delhi lost its grip over the outlying provinces very soon after Firuz Shah Tughlaq's death, we find provincial governors throwing off their yoke of submission and asserting themselves in different directions, whether it was Gujarat and Multan in the west, Bengal in the east, Jaunpur in the north, or Deccan in the south. But what these people did, of course, was to undertake ambitious architectural programs. Their immediate inspiration, of course, was the Tughlaq metropolitan style. But what emerged was a proliferation of regional styles, each style responding to local conditions. Consider the triumphant portal attached to the Atala Masjid in Jaunpur, a major culture center from around 1394. And it is attached to a graceful Iwan, that is a domed hall. Or even consider the mosques built by the Ahmad Shahi dynasty between 1408 and 1578. They consciously employ Hindu techniques, for example, rich temple decorations and corbelled domes resting on piers. I may even talk about the unusual style, the unusual technique adopted by the Bahmani sultans who, in an effort to throw off the yoke of the Delhi sultans, tread their own independent way by emulating the styles of the Iranians, the Seljuks, or the Timurids.
The cultural history of India has evolved over the ages prior to the coming of the Muslim rulers. The Delhi Sultanate brought about a new dimension in the development of this cultural history. Architecture flourished under the rulers of the Delhi Sultanate. It paved the way for the architectural splendor to reach its zenith during the reign of the great Mughal rulers of India.